The low light of the cafe caught the steam rising from her tea, a small ghost dancing between her and the man seated opposite. Ava shifted her weight, the worn vinyl of the booth sighing beneath her. This was her third blind date in as many months, each one a carefully orchestrated escape from a life that felt increasingly small, a world bounded by her daughter's bedtime and the chime of the register at the library where she worked. The man, Kaido, was nothing like his profile. The picture had shown a man with a kind, if serious, smile. The man before her was a statue carved from granite and silence. He had not smiled once. His suit was impossibly sharp, his stillness a force field. He watched her, his dark eyes missing nothing, and she felt less like a date and more like a specimen under glass. She was about to murmur a polite excuse, something about a babysitter, when he tilted his head to listen to the waitress. The movement exposed the skin just above his collar, and for the first time, she saw it. A tattoo. It was intricate, a flower with 5 distinct petals inked in a deep, faded black, almost charcoal. It was a camellia. Her breath caught in her throat. The world tilted, the clatter of the cafe fading into a dull roar in her ears. She leaned forward, her voice a near whisper, forgetting all decorum, all the careful walls she had built. "My mother," she said, her words stumbling out. "She has a tattoo just like yours." Kaido's had snapped back to her. His eyes, which had been merely observant, now burned with a cold, terrifying intensity. The air grew thick, heavy with unspoken things. He did not speak. He simply stared, and in that silence, Ava felt a door open onto a darkness she never knew existed. What she did not know was that this single, impossible sentence had just undone 30 years of secrets, lies, and bloodshed. It had lit a fuse that ran all the way back to the rain-slicked streets of Tokyo, to a promise made by a dying man to his son. And outside the cafe, in a sleek black car parked across the street, a man lowered a pair of binoculars and spoke quietly into his phone. The date was over. The hunt had just begun. If you are new here, I would be so honored if you would subscribe to the channel for more stories like this one. Now, let us get into it. Ava felt the change in the room like a drop in pressure before a storm. Kaido's stillness was no longer passive, it was predatory. He placed his cup down with a precision that made no sound, a deliberate, controlled movement that was more menacing than any sudden gesture. "Your mother," he said, his voice low and devoid of inflection. It was not a question. It was a demand for information. "Where is she?" Ava's heart hammered against her ribs. This was wrong. This was not the awkward end of a bad date. This was something else entirely. She pulled back, her hands finding the edge of the table. She passed away. A long time ago. When I was a child, she tried to make her voice light, to dismiss the intensity of the moment, but it came out thin and shaky. It was just a coincidence. "I'm sorry, I shouldn't have mentioned it." Kaido's gaze did not soften. It was as if he were looking straight through her, seeing not a 27-year-old librarian and single mother, but a ghost. He slowly reached into his jacket, and for a terrifying second, she thought he was reaching for a weapon. Instead, he pulled out a slim wallet and placed several large bills on the table, more than enough to cover their untouched drinks. "The date is concluded," he stated, rising from the booth with a fluid grace that was unnerving. He stood over her for a moment, a tall, imposing shadow. "It was a pleasure to meet you, Ava." He used her name for the first time, and it sounded like a judgment. Then he was gone, moving through the cafe and out the door without a backward glance, leaving her alone in the sudden, deafening silence. Ava sat there for a full 10 minutes, her tea growing cold, her mind racing. She tried to laugh it off, to tell herself he was just a strange, intense man. But she could not shake the feeling of his eyes on her, the cold fire that had ignited when she mentioned a simple, faded tattoo. She finally gathered her things and left, pulling her coat tight against a chill that had nothing to do with the evening air. As she walked to the bus stop, she did not notice the black sedan that pulled away from the curb a block behind her, keeping a steady, patient distance. She was thinking only of getting home to Lily, her 6-year-old daughter, the bright, warm center of her universe. Home was her sanctuary, but the sanctuary was about to be breached. The sanctuary was a small, two-bedroom apartment above a laundromat, filled with the scent of fabric softener and Lily's crayon drawings taped to the walls. It was humble, but it was theirs. When Ava walked in, Lily launched herself into her arms, all warm limbs and the sweet smell of strawberry shampoo. "Did you have fun, Mommy?" Lily asked, her bright eyes searching Ava's face. Ava forced a smile, hugging her daughter tight. "It was very quiet, sweetie. I missed you more." She paid the teenage babysitter, went through their bedtime routine, a story about a brave mouse, a glass of water, 3 kisses on the forehead, and finally sank onto her worn sofa. The strange encounter at the cafe felt a world away, a bizarre dream. She went into her bedroom and opened a small, lacquered wooden box on her dresser. It was the only thing she had left of her mother. Inside lay a few faded photographs of a woman with Ava's eyes, a pressed flower, and a silver locket. Her mother had been an orphan, a ward of the state who had died of pneumonia when Ava was just 4. That was the entire story she had ever known. She had no other family, no history to speak of. The tattoo was the one mystery. In the clearest photo, a candid shot of her mother laughing in a park, you could just see the edge of the 5-petaled flower peeking from the collar of her shirt. Ava had spent her childhood tracing that shape, wondering about its meaning. Now, to see it again so vividly on a man like Kaito, it was an impossibility that made her head spin. She closed the box and tried to push it from her mind. It was a fluke. It had to be, but sleep did not come easily. She was haunted by the memory of his eyes. Miles away, in a penthouse apartment that overlooked the city like a hawk's nest, Kaito stood before a wall of glass. His subordinate, a man named Tadashi, stood silently behind him. "The report," Kaito said, his voice calm. "Her name is Ava Roberts, 27. A librarian. A single mother to a 6-year-old girl, Lily. No criminal record. No family. Her mother, listed as Sarah Roberts, died 23 years ago. An orphan. The trail ends there." Kaito remained silent, his gaze fixed on the sprawling city lights below. "The tattoo," Tadashi added, his voice hesitant. "It is unmistakable. The Ishikawagumi camellia." Kaito finally turned, his face an unreadable mask. "Find out everything about Sarah Roberts. Every hospital she was in, every foster home she lived in. I want to know where she came from. And I want a 24-hour watch on Ava Roberts and her child. Nothing happens to them. Nothing. But I want to know every move they make. Is that understood?" Tadashi bowed low. "Hi, Oyabun." He backed out of the room, leaving Kaito alone with the reflection of a ghost in the glass. The coincidence was too great, the implications too vast. If what he suspected was true, then this quiet librarian was not just a stranger from a blind date. She was a loose thread that could unravel his entire world. Or, perhaps, she was the one thing that could finally stitch it back together. The first sign of trouble came a week later. It was an envelope slipped under her apartment door, a formal-looking letter from her landlord, Mr. Henderson. He was terminating her lease, effective in 30 days, citing nebulous violations of building policy. Ava's blood ran cold. She had lived there for 5 years, had never been late with rent, had never caused a problem. She marched downstairs to the landlord's ground-floor apartment, the letter clutched in her hand. Henderson, a paunchy man with shifty eyes, refused to meet her gaze. "It's a business decision, Ms. Roberts," he mumbled, adjusting his glasses. "We're renovating? You haven't fixed the leak in my bathroom in 6 months, Ava countered, her voice steady despite the panic rising in her chest. "This is completely out of the blue. I have a daughter. We have nowhere to go on such short notice. 30 days is the legal requirement," he said, already starting to close the door.
"I'm sorry."
"It's final." Ava stood in the dim hallway, the flimsy door shut in her face. This was a disaster. Her savings were meager, and the rental market was brutal. The thought of uprooting Lily, of the instability and fear, made her feel sick. She didn't understand. It made no sense. Across the street, from the passenger seat of the black sedan, A man took a photograph of the closed door and sent it with a simple text, "The landlord has made contact." The reply was instantaneous. Observe her reaction. Report any signs of distress. The man watched as Ava slumped against the wall for a moment, her shoulders heavy. He watched her straighten up, take a deep breath, and march back up the stairs, her back rigid with a resolve he could see even from a distance. He typed another message. She is distressed. But she is not breaking. In his penthouse, Kaido read the message and felt a flicker of something he had not allowed himself to feel in years: reluctant admiration. He had put the pressure on Henderson himself, a simple, untraceable financial incentive to evict the woman in 2B. It was a test. A cruel one, he admitted to himself, but necessary. He needed to see what she was made of. Would she fold? Would she run? Or would she fight? He needed to know if she had any of the Ishikawa blood in her veins. Because Tadashi's initial report had come back with something unsettling. The orphanage where Sarah Roberts had supposedly grown up had no record of her. The hospital where she was said to have died had no record of her death. It was as if she had been a ghost long before she was in the ground. Someone had gone to great lengths to create a false identity, and someone else more recently had gone to great lengths to scrub even that away. The only solid thing they had was the tattoo, the symbol of his family. A symbol that was only ever given to those in the direct bloodline. A symbol his own sister, Hiromi, had borne on the same spot on her neck before she had vanished from his life forever, 30 years ago. Ava refused to be broken. She spent the next 2 days poring over tenant rights laws at the library during her lunch breaks. She wrote a formal letter to Henderson, citing the specific statutes his eviction notice violated. She would not be bullied out of her home. But the pressure mounted. The leak in her bathroom suddenly became a flood. The heating in her apartment went out on the coldest night of the month. Henderson claimed ignorance, promising to send a repairman who never arrived. It was a war of attrition, and Ava was exhausted, her nerves frayed. She tried to shield Lily from it, plastering on a bright smile and reading bedtime stories with a voice that didn't betray the knot of fear in her stomach. The men in the black sedan documented every incident, every sign of Ava's quiet, stubborn defiance. Their reports to Kaido were concise and factual, but a narrative was beginning to form. One of a woman who, when cornered, did not lash out or crumble, but grew still, focused and unyielding. One evening, as Ava was carrying a bag of groceries up the stairs, Henderson was waiting for her in the hallway. He had 2 large, brutish men with him, men who did not look like they were there to discuss plumbing. "Ms. Roberts," Henderson said, his voice slick with false confidence. "We need to talk about your departure." Ava clutched her grocery bag, her knuckles white. "There's nothing to talk about, Mr. Henderson. Your notice is illegal, and you know it." One of the men took a step forward, looming over her. "The boss says you're leaving," the man growled. "Maybe you didn't understand him." Ava's heart pounded, but she held her ground, her eyes flashing. She thought of Lily, safe inside with the television on, and a protective fire ignited within her. "And I'm telling you," she said, her voice low and clear, "that I am not at that exact moment." The main door to the building opened. Kaido stepped inside. He was not dressed in the sharp suit from their date, but in a simple dark jacket and trousers. He looked calm, almost casual, but his presence sucked all the air out of the hallway. The 2 thugs froze. Henderson's face went pale. They recognized him, or, at least, they recognized the kind of power he represented. He moved without a sound, stopping beside Ava. He didn't look at Henderson or his men. His eyes were fixed only on her. "Is there a problem here?" he asked, his voice quiet but carrying the weight of a death sentence. Henderson began to stammer, a sheen of sweat on his forehead. "And no, sir. No problem. Just a misunderstanding with a tenant." Kaido's gaze flickered to the men, a brief, dismissive glance that made them shrink back. "Leave," he said. It was not a request. The 2 men practically stumbled over each other in their haste to get out the door. Henderson was left trembling, trapped between a woman he had terrorized and a man who could erase him. Kaido turned his full attention to the terrified landlord. He took a slow, deliberate step forward, and Henderson flinched, as if he'd been struck. "You have been harassing this woman," Kaito said, his voice a blade of ice. "You have tried to force her from her home. You have brought thugs to intimidate her in front of her child's door." Henderson was shaking his head, sputtering denials. "It wasn't. I was told to." "I do not care what you were told," Kaito interrupted, his voice dropping even lower. "You will fix her heat. You will fix her plumbing. You will draw up a new 5-year lease at her current rent. And you will never, ever speak to her again unless she speaks to you first. If she so much as gets a draft from a window you failed to seal, I will hold you personally responsible." He paused, letting the silence stretch. "And all evidence of this conversation will disappear. We have never met. You simply had a change of heart. Is that clear?" Henderson nodded frantically, unable to form words. "Good," Kaito said. He then turned his back on the landlord, a complete dismissal, and faced Ava. The raw menace vanished from his expression, replaced by something unreadable, something almost gentle. "May I come in?" he asked. Ava was still reeling, the grocery bag heavy in her hand. She stared at him, at the man who had orchestrated this nightmare and then ended it in the span of 30 seconds. She should have been terrified of him. A part of her was. But another part, the part that had felt so alone and helpless moments before, felt a strange, profound sense of relief. She looked at his dark, steady eyes and saw not a monster, but a shield. She gave a small, jerky nod and pushed her apartment door open. The apartment was filled with the warm, yellow light from her living room lamp and the faint sound of cartoons from the television. It was her world, her safe space, and she had just invited in the most dangerous man she had ever met. He stepped inside, his presence seeming to fill the small room. Lily, hearing the new voice, poked her head around the corner. She saw the tall, serious man, and her eyes went wide. She clutched the stuffed bunny she always carried. Kaito's gaze fell on the little girl, and for the first time, the granite facade of his expression softened, cracking just enough to show something human beneath. He gave a slight, almost imperceptible bow of his head in her direction. "Hello," he said, his voice softer than Ava had ever heard it. Lily, instead of being scared, simply tilted her head. "You're the man from the picture Mommy drew," she said with the simple logic of a child. Ava's face flushed. She had been sketching idly one night, trying to capture the intricate flower tattoo from memory. Lily must have seen it. Kaito looked at Ava, a question in his eyes. "You drew my tattoo?" I was just trying to remember it," she stammered. "My mother's was so faded. I wanted to see it clearly." He held her gaze, and the space between them was charged with the unspoken truth they were circling. "Tell me about your mother," he said, not as a demand this time, but as a plea. And so, in the quiet of her living room, with her daughter watching curiously, Ava began to tell him the short, sad story of the woman she barely knew. Ava spoke, and Kaito listened with an unnerving stillness. She told him what little she knew, that her mother, Sarah, was kind and quiet, with a laugh that sounded like wind chimes. That she worked 2 jobs and was always tired, but always had time for a bedtime story. That she was fiercely protective. "She always told me we were a team," Ava murmured, her gaze distant. "Just the 2 of us against the world." She explained how her mother had gotten sick suddenly, a fever that turned into pneumonia, and how she had died in a county hospital, leaving Ava an orphan at 4 years old. She had bounced between 3 different foster homes before aging out of the system. "This box is all I have," she said, gesturing to the small lacquered box on the bookshelf. Kaito's eyes were fixed on it. "May I?" he asked. Ava nodded. He walked over to the shelf and picked it up with a reverence that surprised her. He opened it carefully. He looked at the faded photographs of the young woman with his sister's eyes, and his controlled composure finally fractured. A deep, profound sorrow washed over his features, a grief so old and heavy it seemed to bend the light in the room. He gently picked up the silver locket. With a thumbnail, he found the catch and opened it. Inside, on one side, was a tiny, professionally cut photo of a baby, Ava. On the other side, tucked behind a plastic film, was not another photo, but a tiny, folded piece of paper. His fingers, which Ava had seen as instruments of pure intimidation, were now impossibly gentle as he worked the paper free. He unfolded it. It was covered in Japanese characters, written in a familiar, elegant hand. His breath hitched. He read the words his sister had written to her infant daughter, a message she could not yet understand, a truth hidden in plain sight. To my little camellia, it began. My name is Hiromi. Your name is Hannah. Remember the flower. It is who you are. It will lead you home. He looked up at Ava, his eyes shining with an emotion so raw it made her ache. Her name was not Sarah, he said, his voice thick. Her name was Hiromi. She was my older sister. The words hung in the air, impossible and yet, somehow, deeply true. Ava sank onto the sofa, her legs unable to hold her. My sister. The phrase echoed in the silent apartment, rearranging the entire history of her life. She was not an orphan without a past. She was not alone. She had a family. And he was sitting in her living room. Lily, sensing the monumental shift in the room, walked over and tugged on Kaido's sleeve. Are you sad? She asked. Kaido looked down at the small girl, at the face that held echoes of his own, and a single tear traced a path down his stoic face. He knelt down, so he was on her level. I am, he said softly, but I am also very, very happy. I have been looking for your mommy for a very long time. The story Kaido told was one of a world Ava could barely comprehend, a world of honor, clan warfare, and terrible sacrifice. He spoke of the Ishikawagumi, a powerful Yakuza family in Tokyo. He and his sister, Hiromi, were the children of the clan leader. 30 years ago, a rival family, the Kudokai, had staged a brutal coup. Their parents were killed in the first attack. Kaido, then a young man, had fought his way out, but Hiromi had been targeted. Our father's final order to me was to get her to safety, Kaido said, his voice heavy with memory. She was not a fighter. She was gentle. She loved art, music, flowers. She was the heart of our family. He had entrusted her to a loyal retainer who smuggled her out of Japan and to America, to a family that had sworn an oath of loyalty to the Ishikawa clan. They were to give her a new identity and protect her until Kaido could crush the Kudokai and reclaim his position. But the American family had betrayed them. Terrified of Kudokai retribution, they took the money Kaido had sent and abandoned his sister, leaving her alone in a foreign country with a false name and no resources. I spent 5 years destroying the Kudokai, Kaido said, his voice flat and cold. I tore them down piece by piece. When it was over, I was in control. I went to find the American family. They were gone. And the trail to my sister had gone cold. I have had my best people searching for her for 25 years. He looked at Ava, his expression filled with a quarter-century of grief and regret. The tattoo. It is the mon, the crest of our family. A 5-petaled camellia. It is only given to those of the direct bloodline. When you told me your mother had one, I knew, but I had to be certain. He explained the pressure on her landlord, the surveillance. I apologize for the fear I caused you, he said, and the sincerity in his voice was absolute. It was a cruel way to test you. I needed to see if you had her spirit, her strength. You do. Ava listened, her mind struggling to absorb it all. Her quiet, gentle mother was the daughter of a Yakuza boss. Her entire life had been a lie designed to protect her. She thought of her mother, alone and scared, raising a child in a strange country, clinging to the only piece of her identity she could, a tattoo and a hidden note in a locket. She was not just Sarah Roberts, tired waitress. She was Hiromi Ishikawa, a lost princess. She never told me, Ava whispered. She protected me. All that time, she was protecting me from this. She gave you a normal life, Kaido said. It was the greatest gift she could give. A gift I can now promise to continue. You and your daughter, you are Ishikawa. You are my family, my blood. You will never be wanting, and you will never be in danger again. I swear this on my father's name. He reached out, his hand hesitating for a moment before he gently rested it on her arm. His touch was warm, steady. It was the first time they had made physical contact, and it felt like the closing of a circle, a connection forged in tragedy and found in a quiet apartment above a laundromat. A promise, made by a dying father, had finally been kept. The next few weeks were a blur for Ava. Kaito was true to his word. The first thing he did was move her and Lily out of the small apartment. He didn't put them in a cold penthouse like his own, but in a beautiful, sunlit house with a small garden in a quiet, safe neighborhood. It had a room just for Lily, painted her favorite shade of yellow, and a library for Ava with floor-to-ceiling bookshelves that he had stocked with first editions of her favorite authors. It was more than she could have ever dreamed of. But it wasn't the material wealth that changed her life. It was the sudden, profound sense of belonging. Kaito, or Uncle Kaito as Lily now called him, became a quiet, constant presence. He was still a man of few words, but his actions spoke volumes. He showed up with groceries, sat patiently while Lily explained the complex social dynamics of her stuffed animals, and listened while Ava talked about her day at the library, a job, he insisted, she keep if it made her happy. It is good for you to have a life that is your own, he told her once. My sister would have wanted that. He began to teach her about her heritage. He brought her old photo albums, showing her pictures of her grandparents, of a young, smiling Hiromi playing in a garden filled with camellias. He told her stories of their family, not of the violence and the power, but of the loyalty, the traditions, the art. He was giving her back her history, piece by piece. One afternoon, as they sat in the garden while Lily chased butterflies, Ava touched the back of her own neck. I've thought about getting one, she said quietly. The tattoo, Kaito looked at her, his expression serious. It is your birthright, but it is also a heavy burden. It marks you. It announces to the world who you are. The world I live in is not a safe one. My mother wore it, Ava replied, her voice firm. She wasn't afraid. And I'm not my mother. I'm not as gentle. You said it yourself, I have her strength. I'm not afraid either. A slow, genuine smile touched Kaito's lips. It transformed his face, erasing years of harsh discipline and grief. No, he said, his voice filled with pride. You are not. You are Hiromi's daughter. And you are an Ishikawa. He taught her Japanese. He taught Lily how to make origami, her small fingers folding cranes and flowers. He was rebuilding the family that had been stolen from him, and in doing so, he was healing a wound he had carried for 30 years. The feared head of the Ishikawa Gumi was finding his own salvation not in power or revenge, but in the simple, quiet love of a family he never thought he would have. The final piece of the past was laid to rest on a crisp autumn day. Kaito had located the unmarked grave where Sarah Roberts had been buried in a potter's field. He had her remains exhumed and cremated, as was their family's tradition. He arranged for a proper funeral, not a grand ikusa affair, but a small, private ceremony at a Japanese memorial garden he had built on a quiet piece of land overlooking the ocean. It was just the three of them, Kaito, Ava, and Lily. A simple stone was erected, and on it was carved her true name, Hiromi Ishikawa, beloved sister and mother. Ava placed a bouquet of white camellias at the base of the stone, her heart aching with a grief that was both old and new. She was mourning the mother she had lost, but also the aunt, the cousin, the grandmother that Lily would never know. Kaito stood beside her, his hand resting lightly on her shoulder. She is at peace now, he said. She is home later that day. Tadashi arrived at the house with the file. He approached Kaito, while Ava was reading to Lily in the garden. Oyabun, he said in a low voice. We have located the family that betrayed your sister. Kaito's face hardened, the old granite returning. Where? San Diego. The man, his name is Miller. He runs a small import business. He has a wife, 2 children. A quiet life. Kaito stared out at the garden, at his niece and grandniece, living in the peace his sister had died to give them. The man he had been for the last 30 years, the man forged in revenge, would have destroyed Miller and his entire family without a second thought. But the man he was becoming, that man hesitated. He thought of Hiromi's gentle spirit. He thought of Ava's quiet strength. He thought of Lily's innocent laughter. He had spent his life chasing shadows and repaying debts of violence. But what debt was owed here? More violence would not bring his sister back. It would only cast a new shadow over the light he had finally found. Let him live in the quiet life he has chosen, Kaido said, his voice firm. Tadashi looked shocked. Oyabun. He will live with the knowledge of what he did, Kaido continued. His betrayal will be his prison. We will not bring the ghosts of our world into theirs. My sister is at peace. My family is safe. The war is over. He turned his back on Tadashi, a clear dismissal, and walked into the garden to join Ava and Lily, leaving the world of shadows behind him. He had found his honor not in revenge, but in mercy. It was the final, and most important, promise he kept to his sister's memory. 6 months passed, turning autumn to winter, then to a hopeful spring. The garden at the house bloomed, filled with the vibrant colors of new life. Ava's life had settled into a new, beautiful rhythm. She still worked at the library, finding comfort in the quiet order of the books, but her life was no longer small. It was full. It was full of family. Kaido had become the cornerstone of their world. He was no longer just a fearsome Yakuza boss or a long-lost uncle. He was the one who helped Lily with her homework, the one who listened patiently to Ava's worries, the one who brought a quiet, unshakable stability to their lives. He was simply home. One sunny Saturday afternoon, Ava sat on a bench in the garden, watching Kaido and Lily. He was patiently teaching her the Japanese art of kintsugi, repairing a small broken ceramic bowl with gold lacquer. The breaks are part of its history, he was explaining to her, his voice soft. By highlighting them, we make it more beautiful. Not less. Lily was concentrating fiercely, her small tongue sticking out as she carefully applied the golden adhesive. Ava smiled. It was a perfect metaphor for their family, broken apart by tragedy, and now, being carefully, lovingly pieced back together with something precious and strong. Later that evening, after Lily was asleep, Ava found Kaido standing on the patio, looking up at the stars. She came and stood beside him. "Thank you," she said softly. He turned to her, a question in his eyes. "For what?" "For everything," she said, her voice thick with emotion. "For finding us. For giving us a life I never knew was possible. For making us whole." He looked at her, at the woman who was so much like his sister, and yet so uniquely herself. He saw the strength, the kindness, the quiet resilience that had carried her through a life of loneliness. He had come looking for a ghost, a debt to be paid. Instead, he had found a future. "You are the ones who made me whole," he said, and the truth of it resonated in the quiet night air. He reached up and touched the camellia on his neck. For so long, it had been a symbol of his burden, of his loss, of a promise he feared he could never keep. Now, when he looked at Ava, he saw its true meaning. It was not about power or violence. It was about blood. It was about family. It was about a love so strong it could cross oceans and decades to bring its own home. The story had started with a single, impossible sentence in a cafe, a spark in the darkness. And it had ended here, in a quiet garden under the stars, with a family reborn from the ashes of the past, their broken pieces mended with gold. What started with a shocking revelation ended in a quiet, profound peace. What do you think is the strongest bond? The one we are born with or the one we choose to build? Let me know your thoughts in the comments. I read every single one. If you enjoyed the story, please give it a like and subscribe for more. I will see you in the next one.